Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 198, A Tangled Matrimonial Web, Part 2. So we've already established so far that George Asquith is married for the 6th time, officially the 7th time if you count Elmer Donlan's 2 marriages with him. So the remainder of this episode is going to cover George Asquith and what he gets up to next, and also covering his children. On the 6th of August 1930, in the Police Gazette under the title of Bigamy in Sydney, Harold George Emerson, aged 40, was brought before the Central Police Bench on a writ at the instance of Detective Sergeant Smith, Markle and Wilkes of the Sydney Police, and was charged that he did at Enmore on the 21st of September 1909 marry Muriel Edith North, and while marrying at Lewisham on the 24th of July 1920, married Elmer Donlan. The said Muriel Edith Emerson, named North, being then alive, has been committed for trial at the Court of Sessions. He is identical with the offender of the same name, alias George Harold Asquith, under committal. And this is referring to the Police Gazette of 1930. So on the 8th of August 1930, in the New South Wales Kyogle Examiner, Harold George Emerson, 39, a clerk, was committed for trial from the Central Court last week on a charge of bigamy. It stated that Muriel North, as she was, but now Muriel Edith Schweitzer, who's living near Bankstown, when she divorced him, she hadn't heard from him for 7 years. And that after Elmer found out that he was already married, then Elmer remarried George at St Stephen's Church in Newtown under the name of Harold George Asquith. He remained with Elmer until 1926 and then faded away. So as a result of this second bigamy charge, he was committed to 12 months hard labour. Meanwhile, he's got his wife in South Australia, and Irene had a daughter, Gloria Dawn Murphy, on the 1st of October 1930. Dates indicate that this child was likely to be George's. Irene then married Charles Murphy in Prospect, South Australia in March 1934, and Irene died in August 1972 in Adelaide at the age of 73. George then writes to the Army from Adelaide on the 18th of April 1932. Sir, would you please send as soon as convenient a copy of my military discharge under George Harold Asquith. Enlisted in Sydney, left Sydney on the Argyllshire on the 18th of October 1914 and returned on the Ulysses in 1915. Re-enlisted in the 2nd Battery AIF and returned on the Orontes in 1919. I lost the original some years ago. I now find it necessary to produce a record to the returned soldiers. Thanking you in anticipation. Enclosed, please find stamp for return. George H. Asquith. And then an address, care of 112 Albion Street in Sydney on the 30th of June 1932. Sir, about the 19th of April last, I wrote to you asking if you'll kindly forward a copy of my discharge for AIF. Up to leaving Adelaide a week ago, I received no answer. I really require a copy as I cannot register for employment as a retired soldier if I cannot produce a discharge. I would deem it a great favour if you would oblige me with a duplicate. The enclosed will give you an outline of the necessary questions required to assist you. Thanking you in anticipation of an early and favourable reply, George H. Asquith. And then he outlined his service record. He said after arriving in England, he transferred to the artillery camp at Heytesbury, which was then attached to the 2nd Battery. On the 23rd of December 1933, in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, it outlined how Harold Asquith, 43, Station Street, Newtown, was knocked down by a tram in Enmore Road, Enmore, and was carried a few yards on the cowcatcher and taken by the Newtown Marrickville ambulance to Royal Prince Alfred Hospital with lacerations to the ear, severe shock and probable fractured skull. He must have recovered, as in 1934 he's listed as working as a casual clerk and living in Padstow Park, New South Wales, but also had periods of unemployment. He recorded that since 1926 I've only had casual jobs. On the 17th of July 1934, with the address of care of 29 Robert Street, Camperdown, he then wrote to the Army again. Sir, would you please forward me the necessary papers to be filled in for a copy of my discharge, which was lost accidentally 3 years ago. I've made several attempts to obtain a copy of the same and have not succeeded. I require the same to verify the fact that I am a returned man to my medical adviser. I have been under his care since December last. Thank you in anticipation of an early reply. And again, he outlines his army record. On the 23rd of February 1935, he's recorded as living in Strathfield, New South Wales, and is an Australian emergency relief worker with the Strathfield Council. He's employed 14 hours a fortnight for £1, 1 shilling and 10 pence, and is paying board. He marries for the 7th time to Alison Violet Boyd on the 13th of April 1935 in Stanmore, New South Wales. Alison had been born in 1887 at Penrith, so she was 3 years older than George. Then 4 months later, on the 28th of August 1935, there is a divorce petition put forward by Nellie Elizabeth Quick on the 28th of August 1935, and an article titled Much Married Man, Twice Sentenced for Bigamy, Divorce Decree Granted in Melbourne. In the Banco Court today, delivering a reserved judgment, Mr Justice McVarian granted a decree nisi on the grounds of misconduct and desertion to Nellie Elizabeth Asquith, 36, of East Brunswick, who sought a divorce from George Harold Asquith, 43, clerk of Homebush, New South Wales, on the grounds of desertion and bigamy coupled with misconduct. The petitioner stated that she and Asquith were married in Fitzroy on April 7, 1928. Subsequently, however, he left her and contracted a bigamous marriage in Adelaide on the 22nd of June 1929. Before marrying her, Asquith had been married 4 times in New South Wales. For 2 of the marriages, Asquith had been sentenced to imprisonment for bigamy. The petitioner said that not long after her and the respondent lived together for 2 months, police called at their home about arrears of maintenance due by Asquith. He left the house and went to Adelaide, where it was alleged he went through a form of marriage with another woman. He has subsequently left Adelaide and has gone to Queensland. Mrs Asquith said that she married Asquith in 1928. He was previously married in 1909, but this marriage dissolved in 1923. Between these dates, he twice entered into bigamous marriages, for each which he received a 12-month imprisonment. Considerable difficulty has been experienced by Mrs Asquith to show that her husband had a Victorian domicile, but the judge eventually decided that Asquith had given up his domicile in New South Wales, and a decree nisi was granted on the 29th of November 1935. In Nellie's divorce papers in Victoria, it outlines her history with him. About 7 weeks after the respondent had left me, I received a letter from him posted in Brisbane in Queensland stating that I would probably know by then that something was wrong and asking me to communicate with him at the General Post Office in Brisbane. I immediately replied, asking him to come back, and about 1 week later I received another letter from him posted at Bundaberg stating he would return if he had his fare. I surrendered a policy of life insurance on my own life and forwarded him his fare. He immediately returned and then admitted to me that he was a married man and that his wife and child resided in Sydney and that he was in arrears with their maintenance. He remained for 1 week and I supported him. He then said he was afraid to stay any longer and wished to go to Adelaide where he could obtain employment. I paid his fare to Adelaide and prior to leaving me he promised to write and send me money and also agreed that he would send for me when he obtained employment. 3 weeks later, at his request, I went to Adelaide and we cohabited happily as man and wife in a room in Flinders Street for 7 months. During this time we were both employed. He then informed me the police were after him again and he asked me to return to my mother's home in Victoria, stating he would remain and fight the maintenance case in Adelaide and then he would join me. I went to Melbourne and about a week later I received a letter from him stating that the case had not yet been heard, that he would write again later and send some money. I replied informing him that he must send me money and he sent me a sum of £2 and then a sum of £1 per week for the following 3 weeks, but he did not write to me. As the respondent did not disclose his address, when sending the money I wrote several letters to his place of employment, but he did not reply. About 4 weeks later I received a letter from his employer stating that the respondent had left his employ and he was unaware of his address. On the 12th day of August 1930, I read in the Age newspaper, published in Melbourne, that a man named Harold George Emerson had gone through a form of marriage on 5 different occasions. As the respondent was assuming that name in Adelaide, I wrote to the Clerk of Courts at Darlinghurst, enclosed a photograph of the respondent, and inquired whether or not the photograph was of Harold George Emerson, who'd been remanded for sentence for bigamy. I was informed by the Clerk of the Peace for Sydney that they verily believed the respondent was the person so remanded for sentence. I first suspected the respondent being guilty of adultery on the 12th day of August 1930 when I read in the Age newspaper of his conviction. And on the 13th of June 1935 in the Newcastle Sun, it says a railway accident. Harold Asquith fell from a railway trolley near Cardiff today. He's 38 of Beresford Street, Homebush, a labourer on the railway, and he had his nose and back injured. Newcastle ambulance took him to the Newcastle Hospital. He's living with Alison in 1936 and 1937 in Homebush, and in 1936 on the 29th of October in the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate, railway timekeeper at Hornsby. It's reported to the Hornsby Police this afternoon that Harold Asquith, a timekeeper employed by the Railway Department, has been held up by an armed man while he was in a tent in the railway camp at Mount Carrangai today and robbed of £23. According to Asquith, the thief forced him to lie down on the camp bed and he was bound with rope. Little over 2 years after he had the injury on the railway, in the Sydney Daily Telegraph it reports from the Law Court that George Harold Asquith and Commissioner for Railways, applicant claims compensation for injuries to head, face and spine, awarded by consent for £2 a week from May 13th, 1937, and liability to be redeemed by payment of £250. On the 14th of June 1940, George enlisted at Port Kembla in the D Company's 2nd Garrison Battalion. He was a metalwork tube filer at the time of his enlistment and was living at Coniston, New South Wales, near Wollongong. On the 19th of December 1940, there is a letter from the Red Shield Huts hostels. He's writing to the Army saying, "I'm writing to ask if it is all possible to obtain duplicates of the 3 war service medals. I had mine stolen along with my original discharges in 1927 in Adelaide. They were reported to the police department, but nothing has ever been heard of about them. I've since obtained a certificate of identification in lieu of the discharge, and now that I am again in service, I require the medals, if only duplicates. If it is all possible, would you please advise?" And he listed his military record again. Alison died in January 1941 in Wollongong, New South Wales at the age of 54. Her death notice was in the paper stating that her death occurred at Wollongong of Mrs. Alison Violet Asquith. She was the daughter of the late Mr. and Mrs. George Boyd, who resided in Penrith for many years, and Mr. Boyd was a railway traffic inspector when he retired. Mrs. Asquith is survived by her husband, Mr. Harold Asquith of the 13 Garrison Port Kembla, and the funeral took place in the Salvation Army portion of the Wollongong Cemetery. In January 1941, there is a statutory declaration in his military papers. George Harold Asquith of A Company, 13th Garrison Battalion at Port Kembla. I solemnly and sincerely declare that I have lost my 1914 and 1915 Star Medal, British General Service Medal and Victory Medal. In July 1927 at Adelaide South, I was assaulted and robbed of my wallet containing medals and discharges issued to me on discharge from the Army. Notification was given to the police at Adelaide, but I have not received any communication as to the recovery of the same since. And he stated his next of kin as Muriel Edith Asquith, deceased. Muriel had died in Bankstown in February 1935. However, the divorce from her happened in 1923, and of course she had remarried. George was discharged on the 5th of August 1941. And from the investigation on whether he was deserving of repatriation benefits or which wife needed them, in the 171-page report, it does outline his movements from when he was discharged on the 5th of August 1941. So on the 19th of February 1942, he moved from Port Kembla to Carlton, Victoria. On the 13th of April 1942, he moved from Carlton to Mount Macedon. On the 23rd of June 1942, he moved from Mount Macedon to Bendigo. And this is where he marries his 8th wife, Elsie Edith Bertram, in 1942 in the Church of England in Bendigo. Elsie was born at Koondrook in Victoria in 1892. She'd married William Corrigan in Koondrook in September 1916 and had 3 children with him. However, William Corrigan died in 1923 and Elsie married William Rhymes in 1925 in Kerrang. They had 4 children, and by 1930 she'd separated from Edward Rhymes due to his drinking. By 1935, Elsie was living in Bendigo. In the 1942 census, it lists George Harold Asquith and Elsie Edith Asquith living in Macrae Street, Bendigo, and his employment was a peace officer. On the 11th of October, it's recorded that he's moved from Bendigo to Footscray. And in this record with repatriation, there is a statement made by Elsie, and it says, "I declare that George Harold Herbert Asquith and my daughter, Eva Margaret Tobin, née Corrigan, are the parents of Gloria Pauline Asquith, who was born on the 28th of September 1943 at Bendigo. Gloria was legally adopted by myself and Asquith, and through the Melbourne City Court, this occurred in 1944. Gloria is currently in my care and custody at Kinglake in Victoria." So George, in fact, had a daughter with his stepdaughter. Eva was 21 when Gloria was born. George was 53. On the 2nd of May 1957, it records that there was a birth of a child, Gloria Pauline Asquith, on the 28th of September 1943, and this is verified by government statistics. It states that the parents are George Harold Herbert Asquith and Elsie Edith Asquith, and the date of entry of the adoption was the 26th of April 1944. Eva Margaret Corrigan married Joseph Patrick Tobin in 1944. And some more on the movements of George. On the 30th of January 1945, he moved from Footscray to Fitzroy. On the 29th of June 1945, he moved from Fitzroy to Oaklands. On the 29th of September 1946, he transferred his pension from Mulwala to GPO Box, Elizabeth Street, Melbourne. And on the 25th of July 1947, from Melbourne to Oxford Street, New South Wales. Further evidence given by Elsie on the 30th of April 1957. She said, "I married George Harold Herbert Asquith, a widower, at Bendigo on the 22nd of April 1942. I do not know the name of his first wife or the date or place of her death. He deserted me in January 1945 when we were residing in Footscray. For about 6 months, he paid me by post £3 per week as maintenance. He was employed as a Commonwealth Peace Officer on the Melbourne waterfront. During December 1946, I obtained a court order at the Footscray Court of Petty Sessions for £3 a week. My husband did not obey this order as he could not be traced by the Footscray police. I believe that he went to New South Wales." He's recorded as being employed by Dukon Condensers in Waterloo on the 1st of October 1947. And a report from the investigating officer on the 30th of January 1948 says that he made a visit to 82 Cheswick Road in Bankstown. The occupant was Mrs. Burtonshaw, who was his daughter, and she stated, "My father left this address some time ago after a visit by the police in reference to divorce proceedings which she was instituting against her husband. She surmises his departure was in accordance of some guilty conscience he had. He'd written to her from Redfern Post Office, but letters addressed to that address have since been returned. His last known place of employment was Dukon Condensers in Waterloo. He had several aliases: Harold Emerson, Harold North, Harold Carr. It's since been ascertained that the member resumed employment at Dukon Condensers in October 1947, and his address was the above-named firm in Flinders Street, Darlinghurst. He was contacted and the War Pension Life Certificate had been duly signed and is enclosed with a letter stating that he wishes his pension to be paid at Oxford Street Post Office. He states he wrote to the Department in Victoria about his pension but received no reply. The member requests that no information as to his whereabouts be disclosed to anyone. He was informed that the practice of this department was not to disclose any information whatsoever to anyone outside the department. This file is now returned." George Asquith died on the 14th of March 1949, and he's buried in the Rookwood Cemetery. Interestingly, the spouse listed on his grave records is Muriel Edith Schweitzer, and funeral arrangements were actually made by his nephew, Mr. H.R. Schweitzer of Padstow Park, New South Wales. There is a letter to the Army from Kinglake in Victoria on the 19th of November 1953. This is from Elsie. "Dear Sir, I am in need of the Army service number of George Harold Herbert Asquith in the 1914 to 1918 war. I think he joined up in Sydney. I do not know his rank. About 7 or 8 years ago, he drew his pension in Bendigo and later in Footscray. At that time, he was a Commonwealth Peace Officer. Could I find where he collects his pension now? So she's obviously trying to track him down. On the 23rd of March 1957, there was a letter from the Carry On Club. My club has an application for help from the deserted wife of George Harold Herbert Asquith, born 16th of the 8th, 1891. Certain information to hand indicates that this man may have died in 1949, and such is the case, his widow, Elsie Asquith, of Kinglake, Victoria, and his legally adopted daughter, Gloria, may be eligible for any pension benefits under Asquith's service. On the 11th of June 1957, the record states that Elsie's application was rejected as she's seen as not a dependent due to a bigamous marriage. On the 3rd of September 1959, Elsie appeals this decision with the board. She says, I am the widow of the late G.H. Asquith. I've sought the aid of Melbourne Legacy and have given them authority to act on my behalf in the matter. They will submit you further evidence on my behalf. On the 22nd of August 1942, in the firm belief that I was legally entitled to marry George Harold Asquith at All Saints Church, Bendigo, according to the rights of the Church of England. The registry is number 2297. He was described as a widower, and I described myself as a widow, and I firmly believed that was my status. I believed that my former husband, Rhymes, was dead, and I told the clergyman that he was dead. Soon after I married Asquith, the Bendigo police called and asked if I was married or merely living with Asquith. I told them I was married to Asquith, and Asquith and I went to the Bendigo police station, produced our marriage certificate and the certificate of my former marriage to Rhymes. Later, the police showed me a paper which stated that it was in order for me to remarry and that my marriage to Asquith was in order. I do not know from what government department the paper came or who signed it, and I have not got the paper in my possession. And the note says, the evidence now submitted appears to support the view that there was no proof that Rhymes was alive at the time of the marriage between George Asquith and Elsie Rhymes, and as a certified extract of the marriage certificate has been submitted, the marriage between Asquith and Elsie Rhymes would appear valid for the purpose of repatriation benefits. And Elsie died in March 1989 in Bendigo at the age of 96. George's children? Well, his children with Muriel North. James Norman Harold Asquith was his firstborn, and as mentioned earlier, he died at 3 months old in Marrickville. His second child, George Lucas Asquith, was born on the 17th of May 1912 in Newtown, New South Wales. George was listed as a labourer on his baptism record. George Lucas Asquith married Alice Nita Clancy in Hurstville, New South Wales in 1937. They had a son, Arthur, on the 10th of June 1938. And George Lucas Asquith died on the 11th of September 1959 at Bankstown, aged only 47. The third child they had together was Muriel Irene Elizabeth Ann Asquith, who was born on the 29th of January 1914 in New South Wales. George is listed as a labourer on her baptism record. On the 15th of August 1928, in the Police Gazette, there was an apprehension of James John Vaness, aged 28, charged with carnally knowing Muriel Irene Asquith 13 years, and he'd been arrested by Senior Sergeant Truscott and Sergeant Dye of Sydney Police. He was committed for trial at the Quarter Sessions in Darlinghurst on the 21st of November 1928, and he was acquitted. It was stated that he was not in the area at the time of the alleged assault. This was reported in the Bathurst National Advocate on the 21st of November 1928. Acquitted, alleged assault on a young girl. At the Darlinghurst Sessions today, James John Vaness, a motor driver, was acquitted on a charge of having committed a serious offence on a girl aged 13 years and 8 months at Peakhurst in September 1927. The girl said that the accused drove her in his lorry to Peakhurst, and on the way home he took the lorry into a side street and committed the offence. Replying to the Crown Prosecutor, the girl said that 10 months after the accused committed the offence, she gave birth to a child. In the witness box, Vaness emphatically denied having committed the offence on the girl, who is his wife's cousin. He said he had been at Lithgow on the date in question. When he heard a complaint had been made against him, he was interviewed by the police and he told them he never interfered with the girl. It was true that he drove the girl in his lorry on one occasion, but that was about 16 months ago. There was a birth of an unknown child in 1928 in Sydney. Muriel had another child, Archibald Dryhugh Asquith, in about 1932 at Padstow Park, New South Wales. Archibald died on the 16th of May 1934, so only at 2 years old. An inquest was held and the finding was that it was accidental drowning. On the 16th of May 1934 in the Sydney Morning Herald, there was a small article, "Child drowned in backyard of home." Archibald Asquith, too, was drowned in a pond at the home of his parents in Chamberlain Road, Padstow Park, near Bankstown yesterday afternoon. The boy was playing in the backyard during the afternoon, and when his mother called him, she received no reply. She made a frantic search for him and found his body floating face downwards in the pond. She ran with the child to the surgery of Dr. Van Espen at Bankstown, but the child was deceased. Muriel then married Ernest Edward Burtonshaw, so she's the daughter that put in the report in the earlier information in the file. And she married Ernest Burtonshaw on the 23rd of December 1934 in Bankstown. Muriel died only 3 months after her marriage, so when Muriel was 21. In 1936, Muriel and Ernest were living at Padstow Park, and in 1943 at Challura. Muriel and Ernest divorced between October 1947 and October 1951. By 1949, Muriel was living at Fairfield West with Florence Mary Wright and Horace James Wright. In 1951, Muriel commenced a relationship with Alfred Richard White, who was 9 years younger than Muriel, and they lived at Challura in 1954. Muriel put a claim in for permanent alimony and maintenance on the 6th of February 1952 against Ernest Burtonshaw in the Deputy Registrar's Court. Muriel died on the 10th of October 1998 at Wyong, New South Wales at the age of 84. His child with Mary Jane Carr was Hilda Frances Carr, who was born on the 10th of January 1920 in Oakleigh, Victoria. Hilda married Gordon Graham in Hamilton, New South Wales in 1941. They had a child, George Francis. Gordon was a munitions worker in 1943 and a linesman when they lived at Wallsend, New South Wales in 1954. Hilda died on the 28th of October 1993 in Newcastle at the age of 73. His children with Elmer Pauline Donlan. The first was Dorothy Ruth Carr, remember using his adjusted surname of Carr, in August 1922, and Dorothy died on the 29th of September 1922 at Freshwater near Manly. Their second child was Donald Harold Stephen Asquith, who was born on the 30th of September 1923 in Camperdown. Donald enlisted in World War II on the 23rd of December 1941. He served in Papua New Guinea and was declared an illegal absentee in May 1944 and was struck off when he was declared officially as an illegal absentee in September 1944. He was discharged on the 20th of June 1946 for misconduct during service. In 1958 and 1963, he was a storeman living in Delhi near Balmain, New South Wales, and in 1968 was living at Dulwich Hill with his mother. He was a crane chaser. In 1985, he was living at 20 Gibbons Street in Camperdown, and he wrote a letter to the Army Records at this time. "Dear Sir, this is my second letter in reference to my medals. The first letter was sent late last year. My name is Donald Stephen Asquith. I served in the 55th Battalion in New Guinea, and on the 16th of April 1985, a letter was sent back from the Army saying that the records indicate that owing to the nature of your discharge from the Australian Army, you are not eligible for the issue of campaign medals." Donald Asquith died on the 28th of July 2005 in Camperdown. He was 81. He didn't marry. And lastly, George's child with Eva Corrigan, Gloria Pauline Asquith. She was born on the 28th of September 1943 in Bendigo. She married Sydney James Pittman at Kinglake West in Victoria on the 3rd of April 1972 when she was 28 and Sydney was 44. They had 2 children. They were living at Kinglake in 1977 where Sydney was working as a manager. And Gloria died on the 11th of July 2021 at Murrelbark in Victoria. So I think that George Harold Asquith certainly deserves the title of A Tangled Matrimonial Web. He was certainly a very interesting man to research. It was like putting pieces of jigsaw puzzle together.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.